Stapakaya Chidharmasya Sarva Dharma Swarupine Avatara Varishtaya Ramakrishnaye Te Namaha. O Ramakrishna, establisher of universal religion, embodiment of all religions, to you, the noblest of divine incarnations, we offer our salutations on this special occasion, a Purnima, but also the Jayanti, or the assumed Jayanti of one of the great apostles of Sri Ramakrishna, Swami Niranjanananda. As the Swami's name suggests, somebody embodied with absolute truth and purity. I suppose the first thing that we need to know when we celebrate the lives of these saints and these great spiritual giants is why we need to celebrate their lives or study them at all. And Swami Niranjanananda has a special status since the nearest thing that we have to a divine representation or incarnation of God is the 19th century mystic, Sri Ramakrishna. And our life is so proximate to that life that it seems much more tangible, because when we study these lives, we are studying two things. We are studying a little bit about Sri Ramakrishna. We're getting a little bit of insight into the way he thought, how he was wired. And secondly, the fruit of his teachings, the fruit of his spiritual influence carried through amongst these great spiritual giants who carried his message, his teachings, and were themselves shining lights of examples to us that we can at least hold up to emulate. Bear in mind that the immediate apostles, the inner circle, in fact, were all of the monastic type. The majority, vast majority of humanity, including yourselves, are not of the monastic type. So is this at all relevant? But many religions, such as from Catholicism, Christianity, Eastern Christianity, as well as Sufi saints and mystics, have shown the way that we can be inspired by the highest ideals, both in terms of householder life and monastic life. Sri Ramakrishna had a teaching for both sets. He didn't put one higher than the other necessarily, but the inner circle were certainly of the monastic type. So this inner circle, Niranjanananda was part of this. And he was seen to be what is called Ishwarakoti, those who are born free already. Swami Niranjanananda was of a great heroic type. That doesn't mean to say exclusively manly, because he had such a generous heart and such a love for the Divine Mother. Just before his passing away, what do we call passing away? What we in mystic terms call Mahasamadhi, that great samadhi, that great ecstasy that goes on endlessly, and you never return from it, from that state. He resolved to spend his last days in a healthier climate in Haridwar and said very emotional goodbyes to the Holy Mother. He was one of those few who truly recognized the importance and divinity, the significance of the Holy Mother. Holy Mother, being the universal Shakti, was also good at hiding her own divinity in order to demonstrate a pure life of a householder, a pure life of an Indian woman, a pure life of any woman that sets an example for purity, truthfulness, holiness, to work amongst the ordinary pots and pans and keep your mind elevated and tuned into the highest source, represented for her as her husband, Sri Ramakrishna. So we celebrate and study these lives in order to get a glimpse into a kind of roadmap. How can we also develop our lives and emulate at least some of these heroic lives? His early days, and I'm going to refer, I should tell you, from this book, God Lived With Him, Life Stories of 60 Monastic Disciples of Sri Ramakrishna, by Swami Chetananda, who's gathered the information from many different sources. There won't be enough time, we only have about 30 minutes, to read comprehensively through this life. So I will select a few passages and make commentaries as we go. So Niranjan, as he was known, was born in 1862. That means he died at the age of 43. And he had a consummate passion for truth and deep compassion for the poor. This was always with him. And according to our system, this wasn't just an arrival of virtues on his birth. This was contained. I'm just going to make sure everybody's on mute, that's fine. We feel this is a carryover from previous lives, previous existences. And not only that, but Sri Ramakrishna identified him as at least a partial aspect of Lord Rama. In fact, from his early childhood, he was known to play imaginary parts using bows and arrows, the part of a hero. Now, of course, the manly side of humanity comes with some flaws as well, some things that need adjustment, some energy that needs to be channeled elsewhere. And so in his case, it was anger. We can see how Sri Ramakrishna recognizes this and learns or teaches him to channel this energy in new directions. But he had a lot of energy, including psychic energy, what we call psychic pranayama, a control over the psychic energy that we all have. So in his teens, he was sent to his uncle's house for higher education, and there he was attracted by the group of spiritualists headed by his uncle. They made Niranjan their medium. They recognized immediately his capacity for a certain direction of attention or a certain psychic control. And this, of course, naturally dispenses corresponding psychic powers. He not only had these psychic powers of insight and contact with other worlds, but he also had the capacity to cure illnesses, so it was said. An incident which was significant in his life is this. Once a wealthy man of Kolkata who had suffered from insomnia for 18 years sought Niranjan's help. The compassionate Niranjan, that's a very important statement. In other words, he's using his capacity, his potency, not out of boastfulness, but in order to spontaneously be of service to another. So he used his miraculous power to cure the man. And later he said, finding the man suffering so much in spite of all his riches and wealth, I was seized with a feeling of the emptiness of all worldly things. You see, this is a start of a great spiritual surge in anybody's life, that we feel a kind of hollowness with the daily things. They're not solving our problems. And yet we're investing a lot of energy in various things which ultimately, to the spiritual aspirant, become delaying tactics, a diversion from our central purpose in life. And it goes on to say, the human mind grieves when empty. It always desires to behold an object. This passion for the world turns to passion for God. And this is why this disillusionment is so significant in spiritual life. And so he became disillusioned anyway with spiritualism. But of course, he had visited Ramakrishna in the company of these mesmerizers, these people involved in hypnotism. One man who influenced my life greatly, Swami Nishrasananda. When he was about 14, he was at a high school, and the teacher, school teacher, was known to be a very expert hypnotist. So being independent of nature, he determined nobody will control me or hypnotize me. I want to learn as much as I possibly can about hypnotism. And his uncle had a great library on the subject, or on many subjects, of course. So he's hunting through the library, and his uncle found him. What are you doing? A little sheepishly, he answered, I'm looking for a book on hypnotism. Why? Then he told him the story of this school teacher with these bulging eyes and said, I want to make sure that I don't get hypnotized, and maybe it'll be fun to hypnotize him also. So a kind of immature position that the uncle recognized, and then said, look, he handed him a book. Instead of controlling other people's minds, is it not more important to control your own? And the book he handed to him was Raja Yoga by Vivekananda. So the uncle and the company went to Ramakrishna and said, sir, this man is my nephew. He can mesmerize very well. He can hypnotize. And he's a wonderful medium dealing with ghosts and spirits. Shame, shame. Don't get involved in such spooky business, retorted the master. This is after succumbing a little bit and saying, all right, just for the fun. But then he soon got tired and bored with it. And he saw the power that was inside Niranjan. And because he had the power to do that, a superior power to these people. But his sound advice, recognizing that this boy was very good, was don't get involved in such spooky business. And despite the spiritualists' expressed desire to use their power to mesmerize Ramakrishna, the childlike master, of course, agreed to this. And sat on a chair, 3 spiritualists around him, including, of course, Niranjan at the time and his uncle. And they began to wave their hands about him. It's quite a humorous scene when you look at it. The master observed their ritual and smiled from time to time. They're quite content, happy like a child. After trying hard for an hour, they resolved, sir, you are a great soul with a strong mind. We are incapable of hypnotizing or mesmerizing you. Then the master got up and said privately to Niranjan, please come here often, recognizing the specialness of this young boy. We often get caught up in these side issues. They seem to be very important to us. And Swami Vivekananda, in that same book, Raja Yoga, is very, very adamant about not allowing others to control your mind, but rather to control your own mind. In the case of Swami Nisrasananda, that advice changed his life forever. And he took up the study, lifelong study of Raja Yoga. Anyway, the master said to Niranjan, look here, my boy, if you do 99 good deeds for a person and 1 bad, he will remember the bad one and won't care for you anymore. But on the other hand, if you commit 99 or commit sins 99 times, but do 1 thing to God's satisfaction, he will give all your wrongdoings. And in this one statement, he turned around a mind that was resolved to be faithful and completely obedient and compliant and submissive to divine will. What a strong will was there. And yet, his stubborn nature was prepared to yield to the influence of this Ramakrishna. Like many others, Ramakrishna had invited to stay at Dakshinaswar for the night. But his uncle became very anxious. Eventually, it was resolved, and he allowed Niranjan to spend time at Dakshinaswar. But what impressed Niranjan the most was, and he writes, he says this, what a strange man this is. Why is he so concerned about my spiritual welfare? And this is in the context of him rushing toward Niranjan on seeing him after some while and grasping his arms and exclaiming, "Oh Niranjan, my boy, the days are flitting away. When will you realize God? This life will be in vain if you do not realize Him. When will you devote your mind wholly to God? Oh, how anxious I am for you." And this is a clarion call to every serious spiritual aspirant. Are we wasting our time? Now, this section on the life of Swami Niranjananda is really divided into a number of subsections. We learn about the training under Sri Ramakrishna. Then there's an episode, service to the master. Then after the master's passing, what he was doing there at the Barangur Mutt, the first monastery that was established by a small band of monastic followers. And so a period of pilgrimage and austerity, the pilgrimage outside the monastery starting in 1897, about 3 years after the master's passing, and the tremendous tapasya, austerities, living a life of a wandering sannyasin, a very harsh life. This lays out a map, really, for spiritual life and training. First of all, we require a solid foundation. We can call this training. And then we require to engage in worship, service, and service to God, and service to man, and service to all beings actually is identical in the Vedanta philosophy. And then we require a period of personal effort. That has to go. We won't get God's grace without our own personal effort. And this comes under the heading of pilgrimage and austerity. And then how to then have holy company. In other words, how to sustain what we have. And so this period is also covered in this section. And finally, how to die is important. When we study the death of these great, great souls, we have a whole mirror image of their life, how they faced this great, great, what many people consider the greatest fear of all, the fear of self-annihilation or the fear of death. So let us just highlight a few things from the training that Niranjan went through. First of all, he was initiated by the master with a mantra. And he describes this experience as follows. He says, one day I went to visit Sri Ramakrishna at Dakshinaswar. He wrote a mantra on my tongue and asked me to repeat it. What an experience. After returning home, even when my eyes were closed, I began to see innumerable fireflies in my room. The mantra was vibrating in my head and every limb of my body. I wanted to sleep, but I could not stop the repetition of japam. I had previously been unaware of this phenomenon. I became scared and thought that I would go out of my mind. After 3 days, I returned to Dakshinaswar and said to the master, "Sir, what have you done to me?" After listening to my story, he laughed and withdrew the power of the mantra. He then said, "It is called a japa japam." That is the repetition of japam, effortlessly and unceasingly. It just carries on. Of course, Sri Ramakrishna's teaching varied from person to person, tailor-made. He was an excellent teacher. He saw that you cannot teach the same thing or say the same thing to all and sundry. Everyone is an individual. And like flowers in a garden, will grow with their individual characteristics. And so there's one famous story Of course, Niranjan was habitually good-natured, but he had this violent temper. And how does Sri Ramakrishna channel this energy? So once he was coming to Dakshinaswar on a public ferry, this is Niranjan, and he overheard some of the other passengers speaking sneeringly of Sri Ramakrishna, saying he was not a true man of renunciation, but he was a hypocrite who enjoyed good food and every comfort, and whose disciples were gullible schoolboys. Niranjan protested strongly, but the speakers ignored him. At this, Niranjan became enraged, jumped to his feet, and began to rock the boat, threatening to capsize in midstream. He was a muscular person. One of the foundational principles he had was he believed in physical exercise, keeping the body strong. Now, he was a powerful swimmer. He could easily have swum ashore after carrying out his threat. The passengers were frightened and they begged to be forgiven. And when he told Sri Ramakrishna this, Ramakrishna rebuked him severely. Anger is a deadly sin, he said. You ought never to let it carry you away. The seeming anger of a good man is something different. A good man will simulate anger for a specific purpose. Let's take, for example, ultimately the controlled anger of the great sage Vishwamitra. And so feigning anger is a very important tool of a realized person, but not of an ignorant person. It's no more than a mark made on water, this comment. It vanishes as soon as it's made. And for those mean-minded people, so in other words, anger arises in a saintly man and finishes. But for those who are ignorant, it vanishes, it doesn't vanish. And for those mean-minded people, the ignorant, that is, who talked against me, they weren't worth getting into a quarrel with, he says. Why do you want to bother about such a small thing? You could waste your whole life in such quarreling. What a wonderful lesson for all of us. Think of them as being no more than insects. Be indifferent to what they say. See what a great crime you were about to commit. Under the influence of this anger, think of the poor helmsman and the oarsman in that boat, innocent people, bystanders. You're ready to drown them too, and they had done nothing. Think also on the global stage how innocent men and women and children are being slaughtered and bombarded by strategic targeting of innocent civilians. Now, in contrast to this, Swami Yogananda, who was also on a boat and heard similar comments, kept quiet and told the master, "What? You didn't defend your guru," says Ramakrishna. Because, you see, Yogananda was a very mild-mannered kind of person. And see the difference in the training. What a wonderful teacher. These incidents not only tell us something about the person we're studying, but also tells us something about the way in which this divine incarnation taught. Now he took a job and this wounded Ramakrishna until Ramakrishna found out that he was doing it to support his grandmother and so on, family. That was okay, not to accumulate wealth for selfish purposes. A recorded incident from 15th June 1884 from Gospel Ramakrishna says this: after the music, the master sat with the devotees. Just then Niranjan arrived and prostrated himself before him. At the very sight of this beloved disciple, the master stood up with beaming eyes and smiling face and said, "You have come too. You see," he says to M, "this boy is absolutely guileless. One cannot be guileless without a great deal of spiritual discipline in previous births. A hypocritical and calculating mind can never attain God." And he said to Niranjan, "I feel as if a dark veil has covered your face. It is because you have accepted a job in the office. One must keep accounts there. Besides, one must attend to many other things, and that always keeps the mind in a state of worry and anxiety. You are serving in an office like other worldly people, but there is a slight difference in that you are earning money for the sake of your own mother. One must show the highest respect to one's mother, for she is the very embodiment of the blissful mother of the universe. If you had accepted the job for the sake of wife and children, I should have said, fie upon you 1,000 shames. And this also is a direct teaching to the one who he knew would take up a monastic life. Advice to householders, please remember, is very different. Two types of teaching are there, one for the householder and one for the monk. Now, later we find another incident worth repeating. Once on seeing Niranjan taking too much ghee, which was believed to create lust, the master exclaimed, "My goodness, you take so much ghee. Are you eventually going to abduct people's daughters and wives?" What a funny sense of humor Sri Ramakrishna has. Another day, the master said to the devotee, pointing to Niranjan, "Look at this boy, he is absolutely guileless." He keeps repeating this. But he has one fault. He is slightly untruthful nowadays. Now, Niranjan held truth in the highest esteem and respect. So just a small deviation from truth. What was it? The other day, he said that he would visit me again very soon, but he didn't come. And hearing this, Niranjan immediately apologized. Seems like such a small thing, but such a high value of truth. And Ramakrishna recognized this quality. Now in the section, in terms of the service to the master, once Niranjan went back home for a visit. And when he returned, the master said, "Please tell me how you feel." Niranjan replied, "Formerly I loved you, no doubt, but now it is impossible for me to live without you." What a wonderful, wonderful bond from there on. Impossible to live without you. And so the master explained to M, the author of the Gospel of Ramakrishna, this illness is showing who belongs to the inner circle and who belongs to the outer circle. Those who are living here, renouncing the world, belong to the inner circle, and those who pay occasional visits and ask, "How are you, sir?" they belong to the outer circle. Everywhere we find this spontaneous inner and outer circle. It's not a status thing, spontaneous thing. Either people have a great deal of interest in their spiritual life and in intensity that increases on a daily basis, or there are other things to attend to, and they progress at their own pace, their own speed. But those who want to speed on, who are destined to speed on, in a sense, you can say, they need to look at their life, because don't forget, Niranjananda only lives a mere 43 years. So, another aspect is this. Niranjananda, during Sri Ramakrishna's illness, became a kind of guardian, became a kind of military gatekeeper that decided who and who could not visit Sri Ramakrishna in his illness, out of compassion for the master, and he was very strong. And so sometimes there were some disagreements, who should be let in and who shouldn't. And Niranjananda had this dual kind of personality, in a sense that he was immensely compassionate and yet immensely stern, immensely manly on the one side, immensely emotional and compassionate on the other. And Ramchandra Datta wanted to visit the master, but Niranjan stopped him at the gate. And of course, Ram, who was a great devotee of Ramakrishna, was hurt because he was one of the master's prominent household lay disciples or devotees. And then he said to Latu, that is Swami Adbhutananda, "Please offer these sweets and flowers to the master and bring a little prasad for me." And Latu was very touched and said to Niranjan, "Brother, Ram Babu is our very own. Why are you putting such restrictions on him? Still Niranjan was inexorable. Then Latu said rather bluntly, at Shampukur, you allowed the actress Vinodini to visit the master. Now you are stopping Ram Babu, who is such a great devotee. Now this pricked Niranjan's conscience. So he let Ram go to see Ramakrishna. And later, when Latu went upstairs, the all-knowing, the omniscient master said to him, look, never see faults in others, rather see their good qualities. And how we find this echo in the daily prayer that we say in meal times, the Holy Mother's last words. So Latu was embarrassed. He came down, apologized to Niranjan, saying, brother, please don't mind my caustic remark. I am a literate person. So this shows how the master taught his disciples to develop close interpersonal relationships also. Sometimes we can forgive, but we can't forget. And if we can't forget, we haven't forgiven. Even while he was sick, the master was training his devotees, sometimes humbling one and sometimes increasing longing in another. During the winter, Ramakrishna would bathe with hot water. One day, Niranjan used a lot of firewood to heat a large vessel of water. That waste displeased the master, but Niranjan was stubborn. He carried the whole vessel of water to the master and said, sir, I don't have enough sense to know how much water you need. And since I have brought it to you, you will have to use it. The master was pleased by Niranjan's simple and fearless behavior. Our goal essentially is apaya, fearlessness. Currently we have this virus going on. A lot of fear is there. But you see, fear of what? There are 11.5 million people in this world who have survived and lived, who had the COVID virus and are now living without it. So the proportion of us getting it is very small. The fear is very, very big. I'm not underplaying it, but, in the context of Vedanta and the Vedanta philosophy, we should be fearlessness in the face of this. We should have great faith in God. Saving a life is the very last of our responsibilities and duties. The maximum thing we can do is the work we are doing and that these followers are doing. And that is spreading the message of Vedanta, the message of freedom. Hey, look, you are divine. Have you noticed it? Please notice it. Adjust your life accordingly. Express your freedom in the service of others. Be fearless. There is no other to fear. This should be our motto. Of course, it was very hard for somebody who loved Ramakrishna so much to see him suffering. And naturally, he was looking for a cure, what to do. Niranjan, if I were cured of this disease, said Ramakrishna, what would you do? With great excitement, Niranjan replied, Master, I would uproot that date palm tree from the garden. Knowing this heroic nature and his overwhelming love and devotion, the master remarked, yes, you could do that. The disciples took care of the master's body, and he in turn took care of their spiritual life. He silently, naturally gave shape to this group of ideal characters. From his birth, Niranjan had been endowed with divine qualities. He'd been endowed with simplicity, purity, fearlessness, steadiness, truthfulness, and renunciation. When the elder Gopal brought 12 pieces of ochre cloth and 12 rosaries, the master gave one of them to Niranjan and distributed the rest to other disciples. Later, of course, at Anpur in 1886, Niranjan with his other brother disciples, in the birthplace of Baburam, Swami Premananda, they took their vows of renunciation in front of a sacred heart, a sacred fire on Christmas Eve. And Sri Ramakrishna had created this hunger in them for God. And they began to spend their days thereon in meditation and austerities. Now the austerities were initially in the monastery, and next to Shashi Maharaj, that is Swami Ramakrishnananda, Swami Niranjananda was the one who looked after the relics and was instrumental in rescuing relics, actually, and keeping them, relics and ashes. One day, he was carrying some sweets from the market for the master's offering. A poor woman, holding her little boy in her arms, was walking in the same direction, and seeing the package of sweets in Niranjananda's hand, the boy cried out, "Mother, I want to eat sweets." The more she tried to control her son, the more he cried. Niranjananda, whose heart was moved, gracefully went to the young boy and, placing the packet before him, said, "Please, eat these sweets." The poor mother protested, "Father, no, you are carrying these for the Lord, for the worship of the Lord. It would be inauspicious if my son were to eat them." But Niranjananda replied, "No, mother, it would be all right. His eating would be the same as the Lord's eating." And handing the packet to the boy, Niranjananda returned to the market to buy fresh sweets for the master. After taking the vows of sannyas at Anpur, Niranjananda went to Puri on pilgrimage and then returned to the monastery 8th April 1887. Of course, this monastery was in very, very poor condition because the disciples could not afford anything better. They were renting a dilapidated house for 10 rupees. And 10 rupees a month, that was their monthly rent. They didn't have a suitable altar for the master. And so Niranjananda was very instrumental in acquiring something and doing his best, planting a bell tree and trying to identify the places the master went to and planning and inscribing marble slabs in various locations connected to the Sri Ramakrishna Dakshinaswar garden. Of course, the plan didn't necessarily materialize, but nevertheless, the intention was there. But sometimes he would go with Swami Virajananda to the Panchavati there at Dakshinaswar and meditate. Now, whenever there was any problem or illness among the brother disciples or Holy Mother, Niranjananda would assume responsibility immediately. He nursed Yogananda when he was suffering from smallpox in Allahabad, served Latu when he had pneumonia, and helped both Balaram and Ram up to the time of their deaths. And when Girish, the disciple Girish Chandra Ghosh, was passing through a period of depression, Niranjananda took him to see Holy Mother, who immediately lifted his spirits. In 1888, when Holy Mother was living alone at Kamarpuka, Harisha, devotee of the Master, was normally ill, went there and began to disrupt her peace. Holy Mother subsequently complained to the monks, and both Niranjananda and Sharadananda rushed to Karmapuka. As soon as Niranjananda arrived, Harish became so frightened by this figure because Niranjananda was such an imposing figure. And so he hurried off to Vrindavan. Later, of course, he recovered his mental illness. What an austere life they led, Holy Mother has recalled, at the Bharanagol monastery. Niranjan and others often starved themselves. They spent all their time in japam and meditation. One day they resolved among themselves, well, we have renounced everything in the name of Sri Ramakrishna. Let us see if he will supply us with food. If we simply depend on him. Now, neither will we tell anybody about our wants, nor will we go out for alms. So saying themselves this, they covered themselves with their chadra, and they spent the whole day like that. In the evening, they heard a knocking on the door. Naran left the seat and asked one of his brother monks, please open the door, see who is there. First check if he has anything in his hand. What a miracle. When the door was opened, they found a man had come from Lalu Babu's Krishna temple near the Ganga with various delicacies in his hand. They were overjoyed and became convinced of the protecting hand of Sri Ramakrishna. They then offered that food to the master and took the prasad. Such things, they say, happened many times. Of course, in our own life here in the ashram, it also happens many, many times. So this is faith. If you go off with no provisions, no clothing, nothing, simply relying on the grace of the Lord, will you be provided for? Who has the courage to do this, the faith to do this? But I can promise you, you will be provided for. I can honestly say in my own life, it has been the case. So, Niranjananda, as I say, after 3 years, in 1889, after 3 years of the master's death, he left the monastery on a pilgrimage, as many did. And he traveled to many places, including Sri Lanka. And he was doing preaching work there. The Swami Vivekananda, was impressed with Niranjananda and with his preaching mission in Sri Lanka. So not only was he doing austerities and so on, but also understood the important message. And there were a number of monks that he initiated into monastic life. So now we move on. He received Swami Vivekananda when he returned from the rest in 1897 and traveled with him in South India, and then ultimately traveled with him up to Almora. He was among the party there and lingered in places like Kankal and so on. And ultimately, of course, Niranjananda became ill and left for Kolkata back again and requested that one of his monastic disciples, Kirtanath, visit him. He was in a very poor physical condition. Swami Premananda himself went to nurse Niranjananda, and of course he slowly recovered. He didn't leave any writings or any recorded reminiscences. But on the 18th of December, 1946, Swami Achalananda, one of his monastic disciples, described some of the important characteristics of Niranjananda's life. And I'll summarize them like this. First of all, he had absolute, complete faith in Sri Ramakrishna, and he had faith in him as a divine incarnation from his point of view. He also had complete faith in the Holy Mother. He thought that anything was possible with the Holy Mother's grace, and everything was possible. He said that one thing that the master did was to dance, literally dance with joy at the prospect of anybody having a renunciation attitude. He served the master from the heart, preferring this to ritual and mantras that others had stressed. He was strong, physically, mentally. He was courageous. He was fearless. And you just have to look at his photo, single photo on his own, standing there with a stick, turban on his head, standing completely spine erect and giving a feeling of strength through the eyes. This you can see. He believed thoroughly and had great faith in service to others. When he was in Kankal, a group of people he encouraged to set up, not Kankal, in Varanasi, the first Ramakrishna home of service that remains today. And he believed in Swami Vivekananda's message of social service to humanity as service to God. He was a literalist when it came to truth. Absolute truth. Even a small deviation from truth he wouldn't accept. When there was an incident where there was somebody who established a temple, built a temple in Varanasi, and he praised him and he offered money. And then he kind of stepped back a little bit and said, well, maybe not as much as I promised. And Niranjana said, please don't give at all, because you broke your word. So he was generous and always ready to serve others completely. And he inspired others toward a spiritual life. He believed in the monastic life of only receiving what you're given. Even if you have to beg in the streets, the food that you get is sacred food. And he also believed in being physically strong. He recognized the importance of a strong human body. So you can get some glimpse into the personality now of this great man. Niranjananda's devotion to the Holy Mother was remarkable. Swami Vivekananda used to say, Niranjan has a military disposition, but he has a great devotion for Mother. So I can easily put up with all his vagaries. In those early days, Holy Mother's divinity wasn't widely acknowledged. Even Girish, a great devotee of the Master, confessed his doubt about it. And Girish was then passing through a critical time. He had lost his wife and his son and was suffering from depression. At that time, Niranjananda took him to Holy Mother and later accompanied him to her village at Jharambati. Girish stayed there for some months with Niranjananda under the affectionate care of Holy Mother and derived immense spiritual benefit. It was partly as a result of Niranjananda's active preaching that many devotees came to recognize the spiritual greatness of Holy Mother. And then toward the end, there's a scene which is extremely moving. Because he had practiced such hard austerity all his life, Niranjananda's health began to fail. During the last few years of his life, he suffered from dysentery. Climate and water at Haridwar are better than those at Belur, and so he decided to move there, and he took leave of Holy Mother, just to receive her blessings. This last meeting was deeply moving, as Niranjananda's pent-up devotion for Holy Mother suddenly found expression. No one understood the cause. Perhaps he had a premonition that he would not live long. He insisted that Holy Mother do everything for him. He entreated her to cook for him and feed him as a mother feeds her young child. And Holy Mother fulfilled his wishes. Before leaving, he fell at her feet and burst into tears. Then he silently went away, knowing that he would never see her again. At Haridwar, he lived in a rented house and continued his spiritual practice, his discipline. His chronic dysentery was inexorably emaciating his body, but he couldn't stifle his inherent renunciation. Sri Ramakrishna had enkindled his spirit when Niranjananda was just in his teens. And it continues to shine. It continued to shine brightly throughout the remainder of his life. He wished to complete the journey of his life alone. Towards the end, he was stricken with cholera. And like a hero, he took shelter on the bank of the Ganga, surrendered himself to God. When his attendant offered to serve him, Niranjananda declined. When the attendant nevertheless insisted, he said, "Don't you want me to die in peace?" And then the attendant reluctantly departed. Swami Niranjananda, heroic monk of Sri Ramakrishna, passed away in Samadhi, 9th May, 1904. Niranjananda's attendant realized the truth of Sri Ramakrishna's prediction. Do you know what these youngsters are like? They're like certain plants that grow fruit first and then flowers. These devotees, first of all, have the vision of God. Next, they hear about his glories and attributes. And at last, they are united with him. Look at Niranjan. He always keeps his accounts clear. He will be able to go whenever he hears the call. Normally, our spiritual progress is the other way around. Normally, we hear about the Lord's glories and attributes, and then we have a vision, and then we get united. But what Ramakrishna was saying was that in certain cases, these special individuals, the opposite is true. First a vision, and then you hear the glories and attributes, and finally get united. Surrender was his final act of heroism, dying alone in peace at a mere 42 years of age. I hope this small, brief insight into the life of Swami Niranjananda, whose birthday is celebrated today, has inspired us, and that we too can be heroic in the face of difficulties and a great example of fearless heroism to others. This is the central teaching of the Vedanta. Om Shanti, 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 peace, peace, peace be unto